A royal retreat in Romania, caught in a web of corruption.
There have been allegations these beautiful structures have been allowed to fall into disrepair on purpose.
A Canadian engineering marvel that lit up the modern age.
If you look at this gallery, it just radiates power.
A vast factory in Uruguay that once played a pivotal role in the nation's economy.
In the early 1900s, 1 out of every 200 people in Uruguay worked here.
And a subterranean treasure with a formidable secret.
They did not want the United States to know what was going on there.
Decaying relics, shadows of lost worlds, ruins haunted by the past, their secrets waiting to be revealed. On the US-Canadian border, an extensive labyrinth lies hidden behind the mighty Niagara Falls.
In the cliff face below Niagara Falls is this huge tunnel leading who knows where.
But why put it here, so dangerously close to such an extraordinary natural force like the falls?
The only building nearby appears to be unconnected.
Could be a turn-of-the-century train station or hotel.
Inside, things take an unexpected turn.
There's a room that looks like something out of a Jules Verne adventure.
One particularly big room is full of a row of enormous blue cylinders. Each one just radiates some sense of power.
Behind eerie corridors lined with rusting machinery, there's more than meets the eye.
A deep shaft plummets over 100 feet and is shrouded in darkness.
So you've got all of this sort of odd construction right next to one of the classic wonders of the world.
And it was absolutely groundbreaking in its day.
Heritage manager Jim Hill reveals how these structures were intended to blend into the surroundings.
So when they designed the building, they thought a lot about the materials they were going to use. Even the kind of limestone had a slightly bluish, greenish tinge, just like the water. So they were kind of blending the look of the building with the water. And then the roof is all done in this beautiful green tile. And that would allow the top of the building to blend in with the tree line.
But the quaint, camouflaged facade is deceptive.
What you're looking at is like an iceberg. You're only really seeing about a quarter of the building.
What makes this building special, and in some ways visionary in its design, is how much you don't see.
This is the Canadian Niagara Power Station, one of North America's first and most ambitious hydroelectric plants. It can be traced back to the late 19th century and the inspiration of pioneering entrepreneur William B. Rankine. But why is most of it concealed underground?
Rankine visited Niagara in 1877, and he became consumed with the idea of harnessing Niagara's power.
And he started thinking about the potential for this huge amount of natural power to make electricity. The need for electricity was literally soaring through the roof.
There was kind of an energy gold rush going on. People had realized that harnessing the power of Niagara could have extraordinary results.
But there were objections to Rankine's plan, particularly from members of the local indigenous community who were worried about the threat to a way of life that had been almost unchanged for centuries.
Indigenous people have an incredibly important relationship to the Niagara River. There have been people living here for 13,000 years. So to create a plant like this, in many ways was seen as interfering with a natural setting that people had enjoyed and lived with for thousands of years. And water was life. They needed it for the fish, they needed it to irrigate crops, they needed it for transportation. Water was everything. So the idea of redirecting it, using it for some other purpose, would have been a little questionable for them.
The wider public had their reservations too. This was new and experimental technology that the average person found difficult to comprehend.
There was a lot of fear and anxiety about electricity. It was considered to be a dangerous natural force that might be impossible to harness effectively. Years of delay eroded support for the project, and it cost them the exclusive rights to generate power for the Canadian side.
Eventually, an agreement was reached on the condition that the plant didn't spoil the view or interrupt the river's precious flow. Out of sight, Rankine's plant recreated Niagara Falls.
So hydroelectric power is when you generate power by using the force of the movement of water. So when you have a river traveling from high to low, if you can put a turbine in the way, the river actually moves the turbine, so you have potential energy created into kinetic energy that we can use as electricity.
Well, the water comes into the plant from the Niagara River, and it travels under these two bridges into this big forebay, just a big pool of water. And then it looks like it butts right up against the building. But actually, there's these big archways, and the water comes in the building from underneath those arches. Water from the Niagara River would come in here, fill this entire area.
Rankine's power plant sent 5% of Niagara's flow cascading down 11 enormous pipes known as penstocks. The penstocks dropped the entire length of the building.
Literally gravity and the force of all that water falling, those 15 stories down to the bottom of the plant, is creating the force that turns the turbine, just like a big old water wheel.
Those turbines spin. They are connected through giant shafts back up into the building, and each of those turbines spins one of those blue generators you see in that main gallery.
This hall is the generator hall. And each one of these generators weighs about 40 tons. So this was massive. This was incredible technology for its time.
10,000 horsepower turbines, the largest in the world at the time, and 5 generators began creating hydroelectricity.
The halls, corridors, and control room were once filled with the hum of electricity.
If you came into the plant when it was at its peak of production, there would have been about 20 people working in here. You would have heard the whir of all this machinery moving, loud and very much alive. You're generating electricity here. You would have felt it.
And Rankine's unobtrusive power plant didn't stop there. Today, an elevator travels down through the guts of the building.
We are now inside the Tailrace Tunnel, which is a 2,200-foot long tunnel that takes you from the power plant back to the Niagara River.
The Tailrace was key to Rankine's promise that his power plant would take nothing away from Niagara. But it too had to be hidden from view. Constructing this colossal outlet right by the falls while keeping it hidden was a challenge. One that was going to require an innovative solution.
Well, by digging this huge wheel pit, you're recreating Niagara Falls without interrupting Niagara Falls. You could bring the water into the plant without affecting the waterfall or having equipment or machinery right at the water's edge. So it's a lot more work to create this separate waterfall. They needed to use dynamite to blast this huge tunnel through 160 feet, mainly of limestone. Then this whole tunnel is lined with about 17 inches of concrete and then glazed brick so the water could move smoothly through it. So all that water that came through the plant and generated electricity flows right back in to the Niagara River.
But Rankine didn't live to see the full impact of his miracle plant.
Sadly, in September 1905, Rankine died just a few days after the third generator came online and started providing more power.
The Canadian Niagara Power Station transformed the region.
It helped supply power to the entire Great Lakes area, and this rapidly became one of the most industrialized areas of the United States.
The Canadian Niagara Power Station was so well made and so beautifully engineered that it continued to function for 100 years.
But in 2005, the once cutting-edge generators were finally switched off. Now, a major renovation project is underway.
We're going to invite guests to come through. Visitors to Niagara Falls can see the inside of this power plant. At night, there'll be an exciting sound and light show that will literally bring life back to this power plant.
On the banks of the River Sena, in the mountains of southwest Romania, are the ruins of a once palatial building.
When you get closer, you see that the town is split between the two riverbanks, and on one side, there's a very grand-looking ruin.
This must have been a really important place, but it's clearly seen better days.
It's very symmetrical, and there's this rusted roof, but it's still very grand. It must have been something quite impressive in its day.
Adorning the walls inside are hallmarks of the site's former glory.
As you enter, you're greeted by this extraordinary painted ceiling. And radiating off either side are long, long corridors with what appear to be Latin inscriptions on the roofs. And coming off those corridors are what seem to be a whole series of cells.
For the affluent people who came here, an experience of pure escapism and indulgence awaited them.
So what brought all of this wealth here, and where did it go?
Oana Karila is a Romanian architect. She first visited this derelict site 4 years ago while still a student.
When I first came here, I was very sad to see this place in such a state of decay, but I was also mesmerized by its beauty because the architecture is quite amazing. I had the courage to just walk inside through a broken window, and this is the window through which I got in with a friend.
Inside, Oana discovered the remains of a lost world. Here, powerful people came to wash away their ills in the healing thermal waters that percolate up from deep underground.
There are actually multiple springs that are underground in this area, and for millennia, people have used these because of their supposed curative properties.
These rooms are individual treatment rooms where people were seeking medical treatment. Each person would have a cabin, and they would bathe first and then have a series of massages and other treatments.
It was and still is believed that these treatments could offer cures for warts, eczema, chronic joint pain, asthma, sinus problems, and even relief to sufferers of long-term arthritis.
Today, Romanian locals know this grand complex in the town of Herculane as the Neptune Baths. When it opened over a century ago, it was called the Austrian Imperial Baths. Only a select few were allowed inside.
Right now we are in the individual treatment room of Emperor Franz Joseph. He came here around 3 times for 3 weeks, along with Princess Sisi.
Franz Joseph was the Emperor of Austria, and he ruled over this empire for almost 70 years. And when Franz Joseph came here in 1852, he declared it the most beautiful resort town on the entire continent. And that's when this area really started to come into its own.
Franz Joseph and his wife, Empress Elizabeth, or Sisi as she was often known, regarded these vast baths as their own personal retreat.
From the central room, there are actually these 2 wings that go out in opposite directions. So the whole room in itself is about 650 feet long. You can clearly tell that this was not designed for the ordinary person. This was a luxurious place.
Despite Elizabeth's royal status and great wealth, she often cut a forlorn figure.
Elizabeth didn't really fit into the royal court at Vienna. She didn't do what women of the time were expected to do. She helped the needy, she wrote poetry, she lived very much on her own terms.
Elizabeth is also said to have struggled with depression and an eating disorder.
Today, we talk a lot about body image, and clearly, Elizabeth felt those same pressures hundreds of years ago.
To compound the tragedy in Elizabeth's life, in 1889, her only son died in a murder-suicide with his young lover, leaving Elizabeth distraught for the rest of her life.
So perhaps at Herculane, she felt a place where she could relax and be herself and maybe free herself from some of those pressures, if only for a minute.
But the inner peace Empress Elizabeth felt here would soon be shattered.
In 1898, even though she had been warned against doing so, she went to Geneva, and while she was there, she was set upon and stabbed by an assassin. She survived the initial attack, probably because of the tightness of her corset, but people didn't realize how serious a wound it was, and she was carried away and then perished later.
The opulent baths' time as a playground for the wealthy elite was coming to an end.
As we know now, a cataclysm was on the horizon that was going to consume Europe in a storm of artillery and machine gun fire. Rulers like Franz Joseph were sleepwalking their way right into it.
During the First World War, all the spa facilities were abandoned. They were no longer used for spa treatment for the nobility. Soldiers from military barracks from that time that came here to seek treatment left beautiful markings on one of the terraces. Two of these walls are marked with their names, year, regiment.
This is when the town started to decline. It would never return to its days of glory under the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
But the story of the baths was far from over. At the outbreak of World War II, Romania allied itself with Hitler's Nazi Germany. But the deal with the devil backfired, paving the way for Stalin's communist forces to overrun the country.
You might think that under a communist leadership, these buildings would have been taken apart and seized and destroyed because of what they represented.
But the baths were fixed up and repainted, and Herculana once again became a thriving resort town. But the clients were of a very different sort.
The idea of such an opulent, elitist town was not really in keeping with the values of the new communist regime, so they turned it into a facility open to all.
Now you have people coming from all over the Soviet Union and Romania to these baths that were previously just the playground of the rich and the elite.
Yet the baths' days as a workers' utopia didn't last. In 1989, violent revolution brought an end to communist rule in Romania.
And as was often the case in post-communist regions or in any region that has a massive shift in government, folks who had formerly been in positions of political power saw an opportunity here.
Unfortunately, corruption happened, and these buildings were played around like in Monopoly and had different owners, and that led to a property chaos.
There are even allegations that these beautiful structures have been allowed to fall into disrepair and ruin on purpose so that they could be redeveloped without having to worry too much about historical preservation.
Whatever the truth, the fate of the baths had been decided, and by early 2000, they had been completely abandoned. Today, Juana and her friends are part of an ambitious plan to save this grand old ruin.
Our ultimate goal is to restore the building and give it back to the community.
The real glimmer of hope here is that the young people of Romania saw their history falling apart before their eyes and decided to do something about it.
Concealed beneath a blanket of snow and ice deep in the forests of Poland are the remnants of a destructive force.
There's one building visible, there's one road in, but what's special about this place is all hidden.
And you can't imagine what's going on here until you go through these steel gates. And then you realize that it's not above ground that you should be looking, but below ground.
It looks like the walls might just cave in at any moment. You've got to be pretty brave to want to go deep down into this particular area.
The discarded equipment here suggests something important was once carved out from these dark tunnels.
There's bits of train carriage, there's some pickaxes, there's a bit of industrial equipment. It's clearly something was going on here, possibly mining, but what exactly were they looking for?
One of the reasons that this space is interesting is because it was kept top secret. What were they hiding down here?
For subterranean explorer Michał Jodzki, it offers a unique window into his country's past.
Behind these doors lies something of huge value. This site played a critical role in the war that dominated the world for decades and changed thousands of people's lives.
Inside, a labyrinth of passageways extend deep into the earth. But there is only so far you can go by motorized transport. The only way to reach the lower levels is to descend by rope.
It is very dangerous to go down the shaft. You have to watch out for the falling rocks while descending. We are now about 180 meters below the surface.
The sought-after commodity buried in this mine was originally discovered by accident.
So uranium was first found in this area in about the 1920s, and it was kind of by surprise because they were actually mining for iron.
Nuclear power plants today rely upon uranium, but there's a much darker use, and that's where this location comes into play.
The discovery of atomic fission confirmed the idea that uranium could power the most fearsome weapons in human history.
That's when you split atoms apart and generate lots and lots of energy. And this was discovered in the late 1930s by the Germans. And at that point, this was a game changer.
Almost from the start, there was a race between leading countries to try to develop the atomic bomb.
The Soviet Union put all their energy into building their own nuclear weapons as a counterweight to the Americans. The one thing that the Soviets needed, the one piece that was missing, was uranium.
These are the mines of Kovari, site of a top-secret uranium deposit that the Soviets hoped would propel them into the nuclear age.
Because the USSR had effective control of all the countries within its sphere of influence behind the Iron Curtain, they were able to essentially make Poland an offer it couldn't refuse, which is, you let us run a mine to extract uranium from this location, and we will pay you a certain amount per ton of ore extracted.
While under communist control, the Kovari mines went by a different name.
The Soviets went to a lot of lengths to keep their uranium mines and research secret. They didn't call them mines, they called them R1 industrial plants.
Rocks containing uranium veins were mined by hand, only with the simple tools. It was very hard to mine because those rocks contain only small amount of uranium.
When you're dealing with minerals that are in key veins, you have to be quite precise, because the miners needed to be quite skilled in not only knowing where the ore was within the rock, but also kind of following its path as they mined their way through into the mountain.
Some people have compared extracting uranium to dental work or clockwork. So the Soviets were willing to pay well for this. They provided good housing for the workers.
But the Polish workforce toiling in the darkness had no idea about the dangers lurking here.
The miners knew what they are digging, but they didn't know all of the hazards connected to it.
The Soviets didn't tell the miners what they were mining, but the health risk was not known at the time.
So when they come out after they've been mining for months or years, and they start losing their hair, and they start losing their fingernails, and they start being sick, they don't know why, because the Soviets aren't going to tell them.
If the miners dared to speak of their activities or the terrible conditions, there were serious consequences.
Soviets didn't allow the miners to speak about their work outside of the mine. There is a legend that the one miner wrote a letter to his brother and then spent 4 years in prison for that.
So the Russian program went on, and eventually in August the 29th, 1949, they actually had their first atomic bomb test that was successful. So they became the second state to own an atomic bomb. So in many ways, all of this secretive mining and the getting of the uranium paid off.
It was a very successful project. They exported about 200 tons of pure uranium. But the mine was closed in 1958 after the Soviets found their own uranium deposits.
For 16 years, the mines lay dormant, until, in the 1970s, it was repurposed for an altogether different use. Ironically, it was for the improvement of health.
There was a period when people believed that being in an environment with a very low-level radiation, like a uranium mine, was actually good for your health.
With the idea that people would go into the mines and lounge and inhale the radon in the air with the theory that it had somehow healing powers.
But the mine's life as a so-called inhalation hospital didn't last long.
In the late 1980s, the shaft lining collapses, and there's just no economic reason to repair it, and so the mine is no longer utilized.
Today, the mine's upper levels are open to visitors, but most of the subterranean passages are too dangerous to access.
Only 10% of the mine now is available for the tourists. The rest of it is closed or flooded, because it can collapse at any time.
In Uruguay, on the east bank of the Uruguay River, is a fallen cathedral from an industrial golden age.
We're in this sleepy, charming riverside town, and right on the edge is this gigantic, sprawling building that dominates the landscape.
Throughout this site, there are varying levels of decay and disarray. The jetties have almost fallen into the water.
From these docks, a product was transported that would change the way the world eats.
There's a huge warehouse-style building, and it looks like it's some form of processing space. You've got high-level conveyors with machinery and cogs and hooks.
At the heart of the massive complex is an inner sanctum that kept all the processes running like clockwork.
You can tell just by looking at it was something important.
The site created one of the best-known British brands of the 20th century and transformed the Uruguayan economy.
Majuro del Grosso is custodian of this site today. His strong personal connection dates back many generations.
Los vínculos con mi familia van hacia mi abuelo y mi bisabuelo, que trabajaron acá en simultáneo, por allá en principio del siglo XX y entrado casi hasta la mitad del siglo XX. Puedo imaginar y sentir los ruidos principalmente, los olores, los vislumbres, las charlas de muchas personas que trabajaron acá.
The story here begins in Europe, and a time when big industries were growing fast. Feeding a dense, often undernourished urban population was a real problem. Baron Justus von Liebig had a solution.
Justus von Liebig was a German scientist in the 19th century, and in 1847, he actually developed a beef concentrate that he hoped would be able to bring nutritious food to the poor of Europe.
But there was a flaw with Liebig's idea.
Europe, Germany, Britain, France do not have vast prairies on which you can raise thousands and thousands of cattle to boil down into concentrate.
Liebig actually decided to look outside of Germany, and to him, there was no better place than Uruguay. They had a burgeoning cattle economy, and it was relatively cheap to acquire cows there.
The factory opened in 1865, but it was soon embroiled in controversy.
It turns out this miracle nutritional product that was designed for the poor actually had no nutritional value at all.
To keep up with demand, the factory's owners started looking for a nourishing alternative. And their answer was corned beef.
This is a canned product of ground beef, fat, and loads of salt. And you put it in a can, and it will last forever.
This is the Fray Bentos Industrial Complex, named after the town in Uruguay where the factory was located. At its height, it was one of the world's biggest producers of canned meat. In the UK, it became a much-loved product, which was found in practically every kitchen of the country.
Corned beef was a revolutionary product. Never before had meat been canned, and this canning process allowed this meat to keep for months, even years. It was truly revolutionary.
The factory had the capacity to slaughter 1,600 cows every day. Each cow provided enough meat to make 1,500 cans of corned beef.
Fray Bentos eventually earned the nickname of Kitchen of the World simply because of the massive quantities of food that were coming out of there.
To give you an idea of the scale of the Fray Bentos factory, the refrigeration facility could hold 18,000 tons of refrigerated meat.
It wasn't just the factory's output that was impressive, but its efficiency too.
What makes this factory so successful is that the process of turning livestock into canned meat has been worked out really carefully from beginning to end.
Desde que el animal cae de la plataforma de noqueo, recorre los rieles y queda depositado en la cámara de frío, transcurre no más de media hora. Acá se generalizó la frase de que lo único que se desaprovechaba del animal era el mugido.
As profits grew, so did investment. In 1883, this became the first place in Uruguay to be powered by electricity. The country's capital city had to wait another 3 years.
La fábrica fue tremendamente trascendente para la ciudad, no solo por la generación de empleo, sino porque generó un barrio alrededor, un barrio obrero y residencial, generó un club de fútbol, generó otros deportes y generó la instalación de instituciones sociales.
In 1924, the factory was sold to a British company, and its new owners soon faced an enormous test. Could their workers step up production to become unlikely heroes in the fight against Nazi Germany?
El corned beef es un alimento fundamental para la Segunda Guerra Mundial en su llegada a los ejércitos aliados por su facilidad de que estuviera en la mochila del soldado, la facilidad de abrir la lata y el enorme contenido de proteínas y que cada lata contenía. El proceso empezaba en la cocción de la carne, después venía el enlatado y después venía el proceso de esterilización de las latas que se hacían en estos autoclaves que tenían capacidad para unas 1.800 latas cada uno.
4,000 workers kept this powerhouse of production running like clockwork. In just 4 months, they churned out 16 million cans of corned beef. Hundreds of thousands of hungry British and American troops were kept fighting fit by eating this great Uruguayan export.
Es muy recordado en la fábrica las anécdotas de que muchos de las etiquetas antes de estamparse en la lata tuvieran mensajes de obreras y de obreros que ponían en forma anónima mensajes de aliento a soldados que jamás en la vida conocerían.
The popularity of Fray Bentos soared during the early post-war years. But by the mid-1960s, the public's appetite for the famous tinned food had plummeted.
There is less demand for preserved food and salted and canned food in Europe, especially in Great Britain. So it is no longer as profitable to can that much beef and ship it overseas.
Then, in 1964, a typhoid outbreak in Scotland in which 3 people died was traced back to the Fray Bentos plant in Uruguay. This signaled the end of the factory's British ownership.
Esto tuvo un impacto debido a que se cerró el mercado inglés, si bien se abrieron otros mercados, pero fue un cimbronazo para estas fábricas y a los pocos años, en 1968, los ingleses la entregan al gobierno uruguayo.
The factory limped on for the next decade. But by 1979, profits had slumped so low, it was forced to permanently close.
Today, much of the facility has fallen into disrepair. It's pretty much only disturbed by the occasional tourist who come in to check out this place.
In 2015, UNESCO declared the Fray Bentos factory a World Heritage Site, ensuring its place in history as one of the world's biggest producers of tinned food will never be forgotten.